The war for Crimea has moved out to sea, and with each passing night, the scale of what is happening on the water keeps growing. As of the latest figures released by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, the 12-day tally now stands at 159 Russian vessels, struck since the campaign began on July 6th, 117 of them in the Sea of Azov, and another 42 in the Black Sea. On the most recent night alone, Ukrainian drones hit 12 more vessels belonging to what officials call Russia's shadow fleet, 9 dry cargo ships, 1 oil tanker, 1 gas carrier, and 1 tugboat. The night before that, 11 vessels were struck across both seas, 5 oil tankers, 1 gas tanker, 3 bulk carriers, and 2 tugboats. This is not a single dramatic raid. It is a sustained, near-nightly campaign that has now run for nearly 2 full weeks without pause, and by every indication from the Ukrainian side, it is not close to finished. To understand where this campaign stands today, it helps to trace how quickly it has grown. When Ukrainian forces first began concentrating drone strikes on Russian shipping in the Sea of Azov in early July, the nightly numbers were modest by the standards of what would follow: a handful of vessels here, a dozen there. Within a week, the cumulative total had already passed 100. By July 14th, it stood at 116. A day later, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces commander and officer, who goes by the call sign Magyar, announced something that marked a clear turning point in the campaign's scope. The operation was expanding beyond the Sea of Azov and into the Black Sea itself. He framed the shift almost like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, declaring that the first round of the maritime battle was finished and that the fight was now moving into the Black Sea, a declaration that, notably, was timed to coincide with Ukraine's Day of Statehood, a symbolic touch that speaks to how deliberately this campaign is being messaged as much as fought. That night, 17 oil tankers, 2 gas tankers, and a tugboat were struck. The tally kept climbing from there, past 130, past 150, and now, with the most recent update to 159 vessels in 12 days, split roughly 70% in the Azov Sea and 30% in the Black Sea. It's worth sitting with that growth curve for a second because it tells its own story. This is not a campaign that spiked once and then tapered off. It has been essentially additive night after night, a strike total that keeps compounding rather than plateauing, which suggests both that Ukraine has found a genuinely soft target set and that it has built the industrial and operational capacity to keep exploiting it without running out of drones, targets, or operators. Whether that pace is sustainable indefinitely is a separate question, and one worth returning to, but the trend line so far points in only one direction. The target set itself is illuminating. Night after night, the breakdown of what gets hit follows a consistent pattern: a mix of oil and gas tankers, dry cargo and bulk carriers, and the tugboats that inevitably get pulled into tow-away vessels that have been disabled rather than sunk. That mix reflects exactly what Russia has been relying on to keep occupied Crimea supplied and to keep its oil exports moving in defiance of Western sanctions. A patchwork fleet of aging vessels, often flying flags of convenience, deliberately structured to obscure ownership and evade the price caps and restrictions that Western governments have imposed on Russian energy exports since the start of the full-scale invasion. This is the so-called shadow fleet, and it has effectively become Ukraine's primary target in this campaign, explicitly named as such by Ukrainian commanders, who have described the goal in blunt terms: the irreversible paralysis of the oil, fuel, and cargo logistics that Russia uses to bypass sanctions and keep its war economy funded. It's also worth noting who is actually crewing these targeted vessels, since the human cost of this campaign rarely makes it into the headline numbers. Shadow Fleet ships are typically crewed by sailors from a range of nationalities, often hired through opaque manning agencies with limited oversight, working aboard aging vessels that already carry elevated safety risks before anyone starts targeting them with drones. When a tanker or cargo ship is disabled by a strike, the priority for both sides, and for any nearby Coast Guard or rescue services, becomes recovering that crew safely, which is part of why tugboats feature so prominently in these nightly reports. They are not only towing damaged hulls back to port, but often supporting the evacuation of injured or stranded sailors. That human dimension rarely shows up in the tallies of tankers and bulk carriers struck, but it's a real and largely overlooked cost of running a sustained interdiction campaign against a merchant fleet, even one designed, as this one explicitly is, to avoid environmental catastrophe and minimize outright sinkings. There is a phrase Ukrainian officials have used repeatedly to describe what they're trying to achieve, and it's worth repeating because it captures the underlying logic of the whole operation more precisely than any raw casualty count could. The goal is to turn every self-propelled vessel into a drifting barge, blind and deaf. That is a deliberate strategic choice, not simply an outcome of what drones happen to be capable of. Ukrainian commanders have been explicit that the intent is not to sink these ships outright, in most cases, but to disable them, to knock out engines, navigation, and communications, so a vessel becomes dead in the water, unable to move under its own power, and unable to call for help effectively, requiring a tow back to port and, in many cases, weeks or months of repair before it can sail again. The stated reason for this restraint is environmental. Officials have said explicitly that the goal is not to stain the sea with oil spills, and so vessels are, wherever possible, disabled rather than sunk. That is a notable piece of calculated restraint in a war that has otherwise seen plenty of destruction with far less regard for downstream consequences. And it suggests a campaign designed for a long war of attrition against Russian logistics rather than a short, spectacular one aimed at headlines. The distinction between disabling and sinking also matters for a more practical reason. A disabled ship removes itself, and often a tugboat sent to rescue it, from active service for an extended period without permanently retiring it from Russia's order of battle, whereas a sunk ship is simply gone. In a campaign explicitly aimed at maximizing cumulative disruption over time, rather than symbolic, one-off destruction, disabling more vessels for longer periods may actually do more damage to Russia's overall logistics throughput than sinking fewer vessels outright. It spreads the pain across the entire feeder and shadow fleet rather than concentrating catastrophic loss on a handful of ships. And it forces Russia to divert resources, tugs, repair yards, replacement crews, towards salvage and repair rather than simply writing off losses and moving on. Geographically, the expansion from the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea is significant in its own right, and deserves more attention than a simple change of coordinates might suggest. The Sea of Azov is a small, shallow, largely enclosed body of water connected to the wider Black Sea only through the narrow Kerch Strait. Operating there, while still requiring drones to fly roughly 400 kilometers and evade layered air defense and electronic warfare, at least confines the fight to a relatively contained and, for Ukrainian planners, comparatively well understood space. The Black Sea is a different proposition entirely. Larger, deeper, busier, with international shipping traffic that has nothing to do with the war and considerably more exposed to Russia's remaining naval assets, coastal defenses, and air power based around Novorossiysk and other Russian mainland ports along the eastern coastline. Extending the campaign into the Black Sea means Ukrainian drones are now reaching further, taking on more capable defenses, and doing so in waters shared with neutral commercial shipping traffic, a combination that raises both the military difficulty and the diplomatic sensitivity of the operation considerably. That expansion has already produced some striking individual results. Alongside the vessel strikes, Ukraine's Navy claimed to have sunk a Russian Federal Security Service border guard ship, the Izumrud, near Novorossiysk, using an uncrewed surface vessel. A reminder that this maritime campaign is not confined only to long-range aerial drones, but also draws on the sea-going explosive drone boats that have been degrading Russia's Black Sea fleet for years now, ever since early. Headline-grabbing strikes damaged or destroyed a meaningful share of Russia's major surface combatants and forced the remainder to relocate away from Crimea's naval bases entirely. Layered on top of the shipping strikes, Ukrainian drones have also continued hitting infrastructure directly on the peninsula and along its rail connections to Russia, with reports of fires breaking out at the Kerch railway station, including damage to train cars and warehouses there on the same nights that Shadow Fleet vessels were being struck at sea. Put together, that is a coordinated multi-domain squeeze. Rail infrastructure at Kerch, naval and coast guard assets near Novorossiysk, and dozens of cargo and tanker vessels across 2 seas, all being pressured more or less simultaneously. None of this has occurred in a vacuum, and it's worth being honest about the fact that Russia has continued to strike back hard elsewhere, even as its shipping absorbs this pressure. Ukrainian port cities have themselves come under intensified Russian attack during this same window, with missile strikes on the southern city of Odessa, killing civilians and damaging port facilities and vessels there. Russia's own defense ministry has claimed dozens of Ukrainian military vessels struck over the same period, claims that, like Ukraine's own tallies, come without independent verification, but that, underscore this, is very much a two-way exchange rather than a one-sided Ukrainian rampage against a passive Russian target. Both sides are using the sea and coastal infrastructure as an active battlefield right now, and both sides are reporting substantial results that outside observers have limited ability to confirm in real time. That brings us back necessarily to the question of verification, because it remains the central analytical challenge in reporting on this campaign honestly. The numbers coming out of Kyiv, 159 vessels in 12 days, are striking, and they are accompanied by a genuinely large volume of drone footage, night vision and thermal video, showing strikes landing on ships that can often be identified by hull markings, silhouette, or even name. That is more supporting evidence than many wartime claims come with. But it is still self-reported by one side of an active conflict, tallied and released through a military commander's own social media channel. And neither Western journalists nor independent maritime analysts have been able to verify anything close to the full cumulative figure through open-source methods alone. What outside monitoring has been able to establish, drawing on satellite imagery, shipping industry data, and cross-referenced video analysis, is that a large-scale disruption is unmistakably real, that dozens of vessels have very likely been damaged or disabled over the course of the campaign, and that Russia's own responses, rerouting exports, suspending canal navigation, restricting Kerch Strait transit applications, are consistent with a fleet under serious and sustained pressure. Whether the true number sits closer to 50 or 90, or the full 159 claimed, is simply not something that can be stated with confidence from outside Ukraine's own command structure right now, and any responsible account of this story needs to hold that uncertainty honestly rather than simply repeating the headline figure as settled fact. Still, even granting substantial uncertainty about the precise count, the broader economic logic of the campaign is sound and worth walking through in some detail, because it explains why Ukrainian planners chose this target set in the first place. Russia's ability to export oil despite sweeping Western sanctions depends heavily on the Shadow Fleet, and the Shadow Fleet, in turn, depends on a chain of infrastructure that is more fragile than it might first appear. Many of the ports along the Sea of Azov and Russia's southern coastline are too shallow to load the large ocean-going tankers that actually carry oil to international buyers. Those big tankers wait offshore in deeper water, and smaller feeder vessels, typically flat-bottomed ships around 140 meters long, shuttle oil out to them, with Ukrainian officers noting that a single large tanker is usually loaded by something in the range of 12 to 15 of these feeder ships. Disable enough feeders, and the big tankers simply cannot be loaded, no matter how many of them are sitting safely out in open water beyond the reach of these drones. That is the vulnerability being systematically exploited here, and it is a vulnerability baked into the physical geography of Russian oil infrastructure. Not something that can be quickly engineered away. The same logic extends to grain. Roughly a quarter of Russia's wheat exports, and Russia remains the world's largest wheat exporter, normally move out through the Sea of Azov before reaching international shipping lanes. Reuters reporting earlier in the campaign indicated that Russia had temporarily suspended navigation through the Don Azov Canal, a critical link connecting the Don River to the Sea of Azov, in direct response to the strikes, a move that rippled into global commodity markets, with wheat futures moving on the news. Russia's agriculture ministry has publicly acknowledged the disruption while insisting that domestic food supply and overall export capacity will not be materially harmed, a reassurance that becomes harder to sustain the longer this campaign continues at anything like its current tempo. It's worth pausing on the language Ukrainian officials have used to describe their broader objective here, because it has shifted somewhat as the campaign has grown, and that shift is itself informative. Early descriptions of the operation emphasized disrupting fuel and supply deliveries, specifically to occupied Crimea, framing this as essentially the maritime extension of the peninsula isolation strategy that had already targeted roads, rail lines, and depots. More recent statements have broadened the framing considerably, describing the goal as the irreversible paralysis of oil, fuel, and cargo logistics used to circumvent sanctions more generally, a formulation that positions this less as a narrowly Crimea-focused operation and more as a direct strike against the financial engine of Russia's entire war effort. Ukrainian officials have also claimed in recent statements that alternative maritime supply routes remain under what they describe as fire control, meaning Ukrainian forces assert the ability to strike vessels attempting to reroute around the most heavily targeted areas as well, a claim that, if accurate, would suggest Russia has very limited room to simply reroute its way out of this problem by shifting traffic to less contested waters nearby. That claim deserves some scrutiny, because it is the kind of statement that is easy to make and hard to verify, and it matters enormously for how sustainable this campaign actually is from the Russian side. If Russia can simply shift traffic to alternative routes, further from Ukrainian-controlled coastline, closer to Russian air defense coverage, or time to exploit gaps in Ukrainian reconnaissance, then this campaign, however impressive its headline numbers, would function more as a costly nuisance than a genuine strategic chokehold. If, on the other hand, Ukrainian long-range strike drones and the surveillance system supporting them really can extend meaningful coverage across most plausible rerouting options in the Sea of Azov and the northern and eastern Black Sea, then Russia is facing something closer to an actual blockade of its own coastal shipping, imposed not by any conventional naval force, but by a distributed network of long-range unmanned aircraft. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, with Russia retaining some genuinely safer routes and timing windows while losing the broad freedom of movement it once had. But this is precisely the kind of question that will only be answered by watching how the campaign evolves over the coming weeks, whether Russian shipping activity in these seas actually contracts in measurable volume, or whether it simply adapts, disperses, and continues at a slower but still functional pace. The Russian response to all of this has been layered, part rhetorical defiance, part quiet operational adjustment, and part open internal criticism, and all three layers are worth examining. At the official level, Moscow has dismissed any suggestion that this campaign will alter its broader strategic plans, and its foreign minister has separately condemned Ukrainian strikes on shipping as conduct worse than piracy, a characterization intended to frame the attacks as illegitimate assaults on international commerce rather than legitimate strikes against a belligerent's war-supporting logistics. Beneath that public posture, however, there is clear evidence of real operational strain. The suspension of Kerch Strait transit applications, the halt in Donazov Canal navigation, and Russia's own agriculture ministry publicly discussing rerouting plans all point to a system genuinely scrambling to adapt, rather than one shrugging the campaign off. And running alongside both of those layers is a third, perhaps the most revealing of all: open, sharp criticism from Russia's own community of pro-war military bloggers, voices generally sympathetic to the Kremlin's war aims, who have nonetheless expressed real alarm at the military and naval leadership's apparent failure to protect the sea lanes connecting Russia to Crimea. Warnings that Russia risks creating its own version of the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point its own ships can no longer safely transit without escort, have circulated widely in that space. And that kind of unscripted, domestically directed criticism tends to be a far more reliable signal of genuine strain than anything said for an international audience by officials in Moscow. Zooming out, it's worth situating this expanding campaign within the broader trajectory of the war and within the broader global pattern of naval and maritime vulnerability that has become increasingly visible over the past several years. Ukraine entered this war with essentially no meaningful navy, and yet has managed, through a combination of long-range aerial drones and uncrewed surface vessels, to degrade Russia's Black Sea fleet, force its major surface combatants to relocate away from Crimea, sink or damage a growing list of naval and shadow fleet vessels, and now mount what amounts to a sustained interdiction campaign against Russian coastal shipping across two seas simultaneously. That is a remarkable inversion of the conventional naval balance on paper, achieved almost entirely through inexpensive, mass-produced unmanned systems, rather than anything resembling a traditional fleet. It sits alongside other recent examples of the same broader phenomenon: Houthi forces disrupting global shipping through the Red Sea and the approach to the Suez Canal using drones and missiles, and recurring tension in the Persian Gulf around the Strait of Hormuz, as evidence that the era in which only large, conventional naval powers could meaningfully threaten maritime commerce has ended. Cheap, numerous, difficult-to-intercept drones have changed the calculus, and insurers, shipping companies, and naval planners around the world are almost certainly watching this specific campaign closely as a live case study in just how much disruption that kind of asymmetric capability can inflict when applied with patience and sustained industrial backing. What should observers watch for as this story continues to develop over the coming days and weeks? A few things stand out. First, whether the cumulative strike totals keep climbing at anything like their current pace, or whether they begin to plateau, either because Russia manages to adapt its defenses and shipping patterns, or because Ukraine's own drone production and targeting capacity starts to strain under the sheer tempo it has sustained for nearly 2 weeks now. Second, whether Russia's emergency measures, the Kerch Strait transit suspension, the Donazov Canal closure, prove temporary and reversible once the immediate pressure eases, or whether they harden into a longer-term reshaping of how Russian maritime logistics around Crimea actually function. A reshaping that would represent a genuine and durable strategic cost, regardless of the exact vessel count involved. Third, whether the campaign's expansion into the Black Sea proper triggers any broader complications, given that it now touches waters used by international commercial shipping with no connection to the war, raising the stakes around misidentification, collateral damage to neutral vessels, and the diplomatic fallout that could follow. And fourth, whether this maritime pressure, layered on top of the extensive campaign Ukraine has already run against roads, rail lines, fuel depots, and refineries feeding Crimea in the wider Russian war effort, begins to show up in harder economic indicators: sustained reductions in Russian oil export volumes, sustained increases in shipping insurance costs for the region, or measurable strain on the Kremlin's war financing, rather than remaining, for now, primarily a story about nightly tallies of ships hit. There's also a technical and operational story here that's easy to overlook amid the daily tallies, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it explains how a country without a real navy has managed to sustain this tempo for nearly 2 weeks straight. Each strike requires locating a moving target somewhere across a wide expanse of open water, which means the campaign depends as much on reconnaissance and targeting as it does on the drones themselves. Ukrainian forces have been building out maritime surveillance capability for years now, using a mix of satellite imagery, coastal radar, and airborne reconnaissance drones to build a picture of Russian shipping traffic in something close to real time. Once a target is identified, that information has to be handed off quickly to strike drone operators and translated into an actual flight path before the vessel moves out of range or reaches a defended anchorage. Then comes the flight itself, which for many of these missions covers something in the range of 300 to 400 kilometers one way, low over the water to stay beneath radar coverage, through zones that Russia has tried to blanket with electronic warfare, specifically to jam or spoof exactly this kind of system. That so many of these missions are succeeding, night after night, at a rate of a dozen or more strikes at a time, says something notable about how far Ukrainian electronic warfare resistance, navigation redundancy, and operator training have come since the earlier, more improvised days of long-range drone strikes against targets like oil refineries deep inside Russia. None of that comes cheap, even if each individual drone is inexpensive relative to the ship it's targeting. Sustaining a tempo like this requires a continuous industrial pipeline. Airframes, guidance electronics, communications equipment, and warheads produced fast enough and in large enough numbers to support dozens of strikes a night without running down reserves needed elsewhere on the front. Ukraine has spent much of the past 2 years scaling up domestic drone manufacturing, specifically with this kind of high-volume attritional campaign in mind, and the current maritime offensive looks very much like a real-world demonstration of how far that manufacturing base has actually developed. It also means the sustainability of this campaign is tied directly to factors well beyond the war at sea, continued funding, continued access to components and electronics that may be subject to export restrictions, and the ongoing ability of Ukrainian industry and infrastructure to keep functioning despite Russia's own continuing strikes on power grids and production facilities elsewhere in the country. A campaign this intense is, in a very real sense, a bet that Ukraine can outproduce and outsustain whatever countermeasures Russia manages to field, and that bet has held up remarkably well so far. But it is not something that can simply be assumed to continue indefinitely without strain. There's a useful historical lens for thinking about what's happening here too, one that predates drones entirely. Campaigns aimed at strangling an adversary's seaborne logistics, rather than confronting their main force directly, have a long pedigree in naval warfare, going back to submarine campaigns against merchant shipping in both world wars, and continuing through more recent examples, like the tanker war fought between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, when both sides attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf in an effort to strangle the other's oil revenue. What connects all of these episodes is the same basic strategic logic. When you cannot defeat an opponent's main military force directly, or when doing so is prohibitively costly, targeting the logistics and revenue that sustain that force becomes an attractive alternative, slower, less dramatic than a decisive battle, but potentially just as consequential over time if sustained long enough. What's different about the current campaign, and what makes it worth studying as something genuinely new rather than simply an updated version of an old idea, is the delivery mechanism. Earlier, tanker wars required submarines, mines, or armed aircraft, expensive platforms operated by trained military crews at real personal risk. This campaign is being waged almost entirely by unmanned systems, controlled remotely with no risk to the operator's life regardless of how the mission turns out, and produced quickly enough and cheaply enough that losing individual drones to interception or malfunction barely registers as a cost. That combination, tanker war strategic logic delivered through mass-produced, low-cost, uncrewed platforms, is arguably a preview of how a great deal of future maritime conflict may end up being fought. There's also an international dimension worth noting, because none of this is happening in waters that belong exclusively to Russia and Ukraine. The Black Sea borders Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, and Georgia as well, and Turkey in particular controls the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits that connect the Black Sea to the wider Mediterranean, giving Ankara real leverage over how this maritime conflict plays out and a strong interest in preventing it from spilling over into a broader crisis for international shipping. Turkish authorities have, at earlier points in this war, played an active role in rescuing crews from tankers damaged in Black Sea strikes, and Turkish waters have occasionally featured as the site of secondary incidents involving damaged Shadow Fleet vessels drifting or catching fire near the Turkish coast after being struck elsewhere. As Ukrainian operations extend deeper into the Black Sea proper, rather than remaining confined to the more contained waters of the Sea of Azov, the odds of incidents involving neutral shipping, misidentified targets, or vessels registered in third countries but functioning as part of Russia's Shadow Fleet all increase. And how Turkey and other regional and international actors respond to that growing risk could become a meaningful factor, shaping how much further this campaign can expand before it starts generating diplomatic friction extending well beyond the two belligerents themselves. It's also worth thinking about how a campaign like this interacts with the broader question of how and when this war might eventually wind down. Sustained pressure on Russia's oil export revenue and Crimean logistics doesn't function in isolation. It's one more variable feeding into the broader calculation on both sides about how long the current level of fighting can be sustained and at what cost. A Kremlin that finds its Shadow Fleet increasingly unreliable, its Sea of Azov and Black Sea export routes increasingly contested, and its ability to resupply Crimea by water increasingly compromised faces a genuinely more difficult set of trade-offs than one operating with secure maritime logistics. even if none of that pressure alone is likely to force an immediate change in strategy. Whether this kind of sustained economic and logistical attrition ultimately shapes the terms on which this war eventually reaches some kind of negotiated outcome, or simply becomes one more prolonged front in a conflict that continues regardless, is not something that can be answered from the deck of a burning tanker in the Sea of Azov. But it is exactly the kind of slow, cumulative pressure that historically has mattered more to how long wars actually last than any single battlefield engagement. And that is precisely why this maritime campaign, however difficult its precise numbers are to verify night to night, deserves to be understood as one of the more strategically significant developments in this war in recent months, not simply as a colorful footnote about drone boats and burning tankers. None of that changes the basic shape of what is happening right now, which is this. Over 12 days, and counting, Ukraine has run one of the most concentrated and sustained drone campaigns against an adversary's maritime shipping, seen in this war, or arguably in decades of modern conflict, expanding steadily from the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea, targeting the shadow fleet vessels that keep Russian oil exports and Crimean supply lines functioning, disabling, rather than sinking wherever possible to avoid environmental catastrophe, and doing so with a stated intent that goes beyond any single tactical objective, aiming instead at the systematic, irreversible paralysis of the logistics network that sustains both the occupation of Crimea and Russia's broader capacity to fund its war. Whatever the precise, ultimately verifiable number of vessels struck turns out to be, the trajectory, the growth in scale, the expansion in geography, the acknowledgement even from Russia's own side that something serious is underway, all point toward a maritime front that has become, in a remarkably short span of time, one of the most consequential and closely watched dimensions of this entire war. For anyone trying to follow this story going forward, the most useful habit is probably to watch the pattern rather than fixate on any single night's tally. A single evening's number, whether it's 11 vessels or 20, tells you relatively little on its own. What matters more is whether the 12-day running total keeps compounding at anything like its current rate, whether Russia's emergency measures around the Kerch Strait and the Donazov Canal remain in place or get quietly reversed once officials judge the immediate pressure has eased, and whether independent indicators outside of either side's own statements, shipping insurance rates, satellite-tracked vessel traffic through the region, wheat and energy futures, begin to move in ways that corroborate the scale of disruption being claimed. Those are the signals that will ultimately separate a genuinely transformed maritime balance around Crimea from a dramatic but ultimately contained fortnight of strikes. And they are the signals worth watching closely as this campaign, by every indication so far, continues night after night, tanker after tanker, with no end date set by the side carrying it out and no clear sign yet that the other side has found a way to stop it.